Professor, I'm looking at a letter dated March 16, 2020. It's a letter to Governor Lamont in Connecticut. The title of it is Urgent Action Needed to Protect Individuals in Connecticut's Prisons and Jails from Coronavirus 19 Pandemic. Did you sign that letter?
So I don't recall sitting here today, Senator.
Here's your signature. Here it is back here. Why didn't you turn this over to us when you were asked to submit documents?
So, Senator, I made every effort to search for everything that I had ever signed. That's not a letter I remember, but I will certainly take a look at that. And
well, we found it was with a search on the internet.
So I apologize, Senator. I apologize.
In your letter to the governor, here's what you say. As they stand, prisons and jails are detrimental to public health and human rights and disproportionately harm marginalized communities, including Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other communities of color, immigrants, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ plus community, people who use drugs, people engaged in sex work and street economies, and people experiencing houselessness and poverty. So if you believe that about our prisons, how are you going to ever send somebody to prison?
So, Senator, I will need to take a look at that letter, and I apologize that that's not something I found to hand to this committee.
You're not denying you said that.
I do need to see the letter to see the context, because again, it's not something I remember adding my name to. Yeah. I can assure you, right. Senator.
And you also say, first, you call on Governor Lamont to release everybody in jail. Is that right? Because of the coronavirus?
So again, Senator, I would need to see that letter in front of me. It certainly was not.
You can find it with, just put your name into Google. You'll find it in about 3 nanoseconds.
I will, Senator. I can assure you that
You said in your letter, Professor, we call on Governor Lamont, state of Connecticut, and all Connecticut jurisdictions to immediate release to the maximum extent possible people incarcerated pre-trial and post-conviction. And then you go on to say, talking once again about our jails, the global COVID-19 pandemic is throwing into sharp relief the untenable state of our penal system and the need for sustained action to shrink its scale, shrink its size, and shrink its scope. You sound here like the district attorney in San Francisco. If you believe that, how are you going to ever send us anybody to jail, Professor?
I can assure you, Senator, that I understand the role of the judge, and that I can assure you prison time is an appropriate sentence in many cases.
That's not what you say here to the governor. You wrote the governor. This isn't some DoorDash delivery guy. You wrote the governor of your state 3 years ago.
So again, Senator,
in law school.
So again, Senator, I would need to look at the letter. It sounds like it was written at the height of the pandemic, where governors were looking for.
You also wrote the governor, you said, people over the age of 55 are at the greatest risk for COVID-19, but also pose the least public safety risk to our communities. People in this age group can and should be released immediately to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. You think the governor just, if you're over the age of 55, he should let everybody go?
No, Senator, that's not a position.
That's what you said.
Okay.
Here it is, biggest house.
Again, Senator, I will look at that letter. I can assure you that.
Find it on Google, Professor. You also say Governor Lamont should issue an executive order to direct the state's attorney offices and law enforcement entities, including the town and city police departments, and any federal law enforcement entity operating within the state, to immediately cease adding to the incarcerated prison population given the high risk of infection posed by the population increase. You asked the governors to tell every law enforcement official in the state to stop arresting people and putting them in jail, didn't you?
So again, Senator, I have to look at that letter.
I don't remember.
I do think there were modifications that the governors were making around the country to respond to the
You also
pandemic.
had an opinion in your letter about, can I have another 30 seconds, Mr.? You had an opinion in your letter about immigration. You said, immigration detention poses the same health risks to jails and prisons, and Connecticut law enforcement must stop feeding people into the unsafe and inhumane immigration detention system. Then you say, Governor Lamont should release all individuals currently in state custody who are waiting transfer to ICE custody, and the governor should declare a moratorium on all such future transfers. How, if somebody is in our country illegally and commits a crime, are you going to put them in jail if you believe this about immigration?
Senator, I can assure you, were I so fortunate to be confirmed, I would treat crimes seriously.
That's not what this letter says, Professor, and it was 3 years ago. It wasn't when you were in law school, and you didn't turn it over to us. We had to find it on our own.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Russell, I want to go back to this letter that Senator Kennedy was asking you about it. You signed this letter March 19th of 2020. That was 3 years ago. You did not disclose this letter to the committee. Why did you not disclose it to the committee?
So, Senator, I have no memory of signing that letter. It sounds like it was right at the start of the pandemic. So I apologize. I made every effort to try to find anything that was responsive
So I guess
to the
if
Senate.
you have no memory, you didn't consider it that big a deal, I'm assuming?
Senator, I'm just not sure. It's not something I remember signing. I don't doubt that,
All right,
that you
I
have
want
it
to
there.
talk about this letter because it's an extraordinary letter. This is not, I know the chairman and Senator Booker were trying to rehabilitate you by saying, well, lots of people did humanitarian release for some people incarcerated. That's true. But this letter is not within the bounds of the mainstream. This letter is actually quite extreme. This letter begins with the undersigned organizations and individuals call on Governor Lamont to act immediately to protect the lives of incarcerated people in our state. 3 urgent steps are needed: the immediate release of as many people in custody as possible. 2, a moratorium on new admissions into jails and prisons. Do you think a moratorium on new admissions into jails and prisons, is that a policy you support?
So, Senator, again, I don't have the letter in front of me to understand the context, but I know there were efforts to reduce new admissions, but there are obviously some people who would present a public safety risk.
But your letter didn't say that, and I want to read from this letter because it is an astonishing letter. The second page, we call upon Governor Lamont, the state of Connecticut, and all Connecticut jurisdictions to, 1, immediately release to the maximum extent possible people incarcerated pre-trial and post-conviction. We recognize that jails and prisons are not safe and do not promote well-being for anyone. The global COVID-19 pandemic is throwing into sharp relief the untenable size of our penal system and the need for sustained action to shrink its scale, size, and scope. This next sentence is underlined. We outline below a few considerations to initiate state action and emphasize they do not preclude the release of groups not explicitly discussed in this letter. Do you think it was a good idea to, as this letter says, quote, immediately release to the maximum extent possible people incarcerated pre-trial and post-conviction?
So, Senator, I'd want to understand the context around extent possible.
It's a letter you signed, so you know the context.
So again, Senator, I don't have it in front of me, and I didn't have a memory of the specifics. Releases need to be...
Give a witness a copy of the letter, which is right there. You'll have it in front of you in about 10 seconds.
Thank you, Senator. I do believe releases need to be consistent with public safety.
Okay, well, that's not what this letter says. The letter continues, pretrial release, quote, Governor Lamont should use his emergency powers to protect incarcerated people, their communities, and correctional staff by releasing all people, all who are incarcerated without having been convicted of any crime. All people means murderers. It means serial rapists. It means child molesters. Do you think it is remotely reasonable to call upon the governor to release every murderer in the state of Connecticut prior to conviction, to essentially eliminate pretrial incarceration?
So I think, Senator, that releases should be consistent with public safety.
But that's not what you said. The letter doesn't say that. It's all.
Were I so fortunate to be confirmed as a judge, I would strictly follow the Bail Reform Act, which includes preventative detention.
But that's not remotely this letter.
mechanism.
All right, the next page. You also call on the governor to do this, and this is a quote. Declare a moratorium on incarceration. Governor Lamont should issue an executive order to direct the state attorney's offices and law enforcement entities, including town and city police departments, and any federal law enforcement entity operating within the state to immediately cease adding to the incarcerated population given the high risk posed by population increase, both to those already incarcerated and to those entering correctional facilities. Public officials with authority to set bail, including judges, and you're nominated to be a judge, bail staff and police officers should maximize release on personal recognizance. Do you think it is a good idea to declare a moratorium on incarceration and to say in Connecticut, we are no longer arresting anybody? Because that's what your letter says.
So, Senator, as I heard it, it was urging a sort of to the extent possible, and I guess, you know, my view at that time with the pandemic is, and I know that the process...
It doesn't say to the extent possible. It says all. And let me ask you, you're a law professor. You signed a letter asking the governor of the state of Connecticut to issue an executive order ordering federal law enforcement to cease adding to the incarcerated population in the state. Is there any plausible constitutional justification for a governor ordering the feds, you are no longer allowed to incarcerate anyone in our state?
I would assume, Senator, that was a reference to using state
No,
facilities.
doesn't say that.
So again, Senator, I think that this appears to be a letter that was issued
So lots
at
of people signed something kooky, but lots of people haven't been nominated to be a judge. The last thing you say is you call on Connecticut to release illegal aliens and not refer them to ICE, to release them all. Is that a policy you support, releasing every illegal alien as well, in addition to releasing murderers and rapists and child molesters?
So, Senator, I think the letter, it sounds like, was at the start of the pandemic and was looking at potential solutions to the systemic high COVID within the jails that is threatening both people incarcerated as well as staff. I will say, were I so fortunate to be confirmed, I would treat very seriously the laws, the statutes that Congress has written that govern binding Supreme Court for the Second Circuit.
3 years ago, you did not.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations to the nominees. Thanks for being here. Judge Kill, let me just start with you. You're involved, I think, with a group called the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Have I got that right?
I did a couple cases with them, Senator. It's probably been 15 years at least since I did any work with them.
Okay, fair enough. Have you done some fundraising for them? Do I understand that correctly, or am I misinformed?
I don't believe I've ever done any fundraising for them.
Well, let me just ask you about, I'm curious because of some things they've said recently, so just let me ask you about this and you can give me your viewpoint on it. Earlier this month, right after the attacks on Israel, the AALDEF said that it stands in solidarity with Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim communities, and went on to help push out on social media a toolkit, that's their word, for student protesters that we've seen on our campuses, including resources, talking points, and chants for students who are pressing to end the genocide in Gaza, which of course we've seen invoked by those who are calling for the destruction of the state of Israel. So let me just give you a chance to respond to that. What's your view on that? How do you read this? I mean, how do you read this statement from this group? Just let me give you the opportunity to respond to that. How about that?
Senator, I have not had any involvement with the group for a very, very long time, and my only involvement was representing restaurant workers and wage and hour claims. I'm not familiar with that statement from ALDEF, so I'm not sure that I could comment on that.
Fair enough. Let me just ask you, I assume that doesn't represent your views, your personal views. the position that the group has taken here with regard to the attacks on Israel?
As I said, Senator, I'm not sure in what context or what that statement was. I haven't read the full statement, so I can't really tell you whether I.
Well, how about this? Why don't I just give you an open-ended chance to say, with regard to the attacks on Israel, the threats on Jewish Americans, what we're seeing on our college campuses, where we have some student groups out there saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free, which of course is a call for the elimination of the state of Israel. Why don't you just tell us what your views are on that?
Senator, it's a very complicated issue. I haven't really studied it. It is a terrible situation, what is going on there. And Senator, that's all I can really say what my personal views are.
Well, let me put it to you this way, would you condemn those who are calling for, who say things like from the river to the sea, which is a call for the elimination of the state of Israel and frankly, the killing of Jews in the Middle East? I mean, would you condemn that?
Senator, as I said, I know it's a very complicated situation. It's a tragic situation. I haven't studied the situation. I don't know how I can answer that today, Senator. Because
go ahead.
As a judge and the role that I would be playing, my personal views of things would not come into consideration, certainly, Senator, and I would keep an open mind for all matters that come before me, and that's the way that I would approach the job of a judge.
I totally understand that, and I'm not asking you to comment on any case. I just am I wanted to give you a chance to respond to this group statement, but let me just see if I can get you to understand your views here. Just with regard to the attacks on Israel and the violence in this country against Jewish Americans, you condemn all of that. You have no truck with that. You would say that we should condemn all of that explicitly, I assume, right? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I mean, you tell
me. Yes, Senator. Any violence here in this country against Jewish people should be condemned.
Okay, and these protests that we've seen where people are explicitly calling for the elimination of the state of Israel. We had Jewish students at Cooper Union in New York who were barricaded inside a library for hours while pro-Hamas protesters banged on the doors, shouted at them, screamed at them. You condemn all of that, I assume. I'm
not familiar with that situation, Senator. I know nothing about it.
Are you familiar with the campus protests that have happened all across the country? The Senate's addressed this in a resolution that passed unanimously condemning that rhetoric of genocide, frankly, against the Jews. I'm just trying to get you to say, I hope, that you condemn that, you think that's wrong, you're against it.
100%, Senator. I would condemn the genocide of Jewish people.
Okay. Yeah. Mr. Fonzone, let me very quickly, because I'm almost out of time now, and there are lots of other senators who want to ask you questions, but I just want to ask you quickly about some work, and we follow up in written questions, but some work you've done for the People's Republic of China, different entities. You did some work for Huawei, I think, in 2018, for the Ministry of Commerce of the Chinese government, and then for the Hong Kong Trade Development Council, if I'm not mistaken, in 2019 and 2020, another governmental entity. That was right during the Hong Kong protests. My question to you is, and I'll give you some more for the record, but my question for you is, did you advise that council during that time of the Hong Kong protests on messaging, on what was happening there? I mean, tell us about your work.
No, Senator, thank you for the question. I know this is an issue of interest to the Senate. It came up in my last confirmation process as well. I think in general, my practice in private practice was focused on advising companies on American law and how American law worked. For the three entities you just mentioned, I did a small amount of work at the request of other partners, much of it many years ago. None of that work has affected my ability to give objective advice in my current role at the Office of Director of National Intelligence, and none of it would if I was fortunate enough to be confirmed at OLC.
This is my last thing, Mr. Chairman. Just last question. But did you in 2019, 2020, at the height of those protests in Hong Kong, which the government brutally repressed, I saw it with my own eyes, did you give the Trade Council any kind of advice involving issues related to those protests?
No, the advice, and I obviously can't get into privileged information, but the advice we gave was, the work I did was basically on advising them on issues related to my practice, which is around privacy and cybersecurity.